Welcome to the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast. If you're just a beginning gardener or you want good gardening information, well, you've come to the right spot. If you've ever talked with a gardener who uses the excrement of worms around their plants, well, you might just be familiar with their wide-eyed look of rapture, talking about all the benefits of using, well, to put it more politely and accurately, worm castings. Today, we will dig deep into the Farmer Fred audio archives to hear gardeners sing the praises of raising worms and using their output, if you will, in the garden, a practice known as vermicomposting. Now, you may remember back on episode 19 of the Garden Basics podcast, we talked with soils expert Steve Zion, and back then he got kind of carried away talking about his fondness for worms and worm castings.
And those are my pets right now. We used to have cats, but now we've got worms. They're actually sitting about 3 feet behind me. I'm sitting here in my office. And they make excellent compost. And the real advantage of this material is the biological content. The numbers of organisms in this material is much, much, much greater than conventional compost.
You can hear that entire conversation about Worm Bin Basics back in episode 19, which was released on June the 12th. But today, the other members of the Worm Castings Choir chime in with their high praise for the lowly worm. From way back when, 2004, we talk with best-selling author Amy Stewart. From 2017, Sacramento County Master Gardener and vermicomposting specialist Susan Muckey. And just recently, organic educator Giselle Schoninger, who works for a company, Kellogg Garden Products, who just happens to be selling worm castings. Shall we go play with the worms? Let's do it. And we'll do it all in under 30 minutes. Let's go. Leading off will be a chat with a New York Times best-selling author who, in their past, was a noted garden writer, but is now more famous for her series of books about the Kopp sisters, which are based on the true story of one of America's first female deputy sheriffs and her two rambunctious sisters. The books are in development for a TV series. We're talking about Amy Stewart, who gardeners may fondly remember as the author of several horticultural bestsellers, including The Drunken Botanist, Wicked Plants, Flower Confidential, and many more, including one of her earliest efforts, The Earth Moved, published back in 2004. It's a book about worms and raising worms and using worm castings. Now, a couple of warnings. Back when this was recorded, I still had hair, and Amy Stewart lived in Eureka, California. Neither is no longer true. She's now in Portland, Oregon, and I now always wear a hat. But despite its age, it's good information delivered by a person who's obviously knowledgeable and enthused on the subject of worms. So let's go up to drizzly Eureka, California, where old Volkswagen vans go to rust away. Today we're in Humboldt County in Eureka. Hi, everybody. It's Farmer Fred Hoffman. And you know what worms can do for your garden? They can do amazing things. I'm here with a worm raiser, garden columnist, and all-around good gardener, Amy Stewart. And she has just come out with an excellent book about worms.
It's The Earth Moved on the Remarkable Achievements of Earthworms.
And it isn't just a how-to book of how to have worms in your garden and how to raise them and harvest what they make, but it's also an interesting sort of history of worms and how they got here and the good guys and maybe even the bad guys of worms. And why don't we get that out of the way first? You have actually done some research and found that in some areas of the country, worms can be a pest.
Yeah, that's true. Minnesota is a really good example of that. What I found, I traveled to Minnesota and talked with some forest ecologists there who have noticed that non-native worms like night crawlers and red wigglers come into the forest and chew up the duff layer, you know, that kind of spongy layer where seeds germinate and where plants really start to grow right on the surface. And they just consume that entire duff layer. They can eat the leaf fall of a forest every year. And it changes the composition of the forest floor and changes what plants can grow there.
I would think the understory would be the first thing to go.
Exactly. Understory plants and baby seedlings. And even here in Humboldt County, you know, we're standing right here in my backyard, which was probably a redwood forest at one time, right? Native earthworms, native Californian worms probably aren't to be found in this backyard, but I do dig up lots of European worms.
Where are native earthworms found in California? Everywhere or in just specific spots these days?
Well, they're only going to be found in areas that have been left completely undisturbed. So parks and any place where we've built neighborhoods, you're probably not going to find native earthworms. The other thing is we don't really know a lot about native earthworms in California because, believe it or not, there's not a lot of people out there digging them up and studying earthworms. But definitely probably not in your own backyard. The worms in your backyard are probably European worms.
And they got here, I would imagine, via the settlers who came in.
That's right. In the roots of potted plants, even horses' hooves, ship's ballast. So they have all kinds of ways of getting around with us.
There has been a lot of talk, and we've talked about it on the show, about the benefit of worm castings. And for those who may have missed those times we've talked about it, tell people about worm castings and the benefit they are to a garden.
Well, I really encourage people to think about worm castings as a soil inoculant because they're so full of beneficial bacteria, protozoa, nematodes, fungi. I mean, there can be 1 billion living creatures in a handful of worm castings. So a little bit goes a long way. It's a very powerful soil amendment, and I really recommend just adding a little bit right at the roots of potted plants as you're, planting your fall garden, for instance.
I'm kind of anal. When you say a little bit, are you talking about a teaspoon, a tablespoon, or what?
I'm talking about maybe a handful.
Okay, so a handful, that's exact.
Close enough.
So a handful of the worm castings in a hole when you plant. In fact, you urge people in your book to maybe get away from rototilling their garden every spring because it disturbs the earthworms to a great deal. And you have another method for planting, the no-till method, and using some interesting coverings. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, I use cover crops in my garden a lot, and this is especially something that you can do if you don't get a real hard freeze in the winter. But even then, if you plant early enough, you can do this, where you plant maybe fava beans, vetch, ryegrass, in any empty spot in your garden where you're not going to be planting, where you're going to let it have a little rest. So the roots go down very deep, help break up clay soil. A lot of those, something like vetch will really help to fix nitrogen in the soil and prevent soil erosion. And then just chop that down in the spring and let it decompose, let the roots decompose underground, and you're ready to plant.
In some books or literature, you may see about cover cropping in the spring to cut it down and then till it in, but that's not necessarily such a great idea, is it?
No, a lot of people now are just saying there's no need to till it in. Just leave it there on the surface, and the roots will gradually decompose underground and help keep that fragile community of microorganisms intact underground.
You talk about in your book when you're doing that in the fall after you've torn out your summer garden is to put in a layer of newspaper as well. How much newspaper would you put in and then put, compost on top and then the cover crop? Exactly how would you go about that?
I use 10 to 20 sheets of newspaper or cardboard. When I moved into this house, we had a lot of cardboard boxes, so this is a great way to start a new garden for the first time. Lay down many overlapping layers of cardboard and then start piling compost and manure on top of that. You could even plant a cover crop on top of that, and gradually the worms will come up and eat the cardboard, and the whole thing will sort of come together and create this light, fluffy layer that you can plant right into in the spring.
So it only takes a couple of seasons that if you did that in the fall, that ground would be ready to plant in the spring.
Sure, yeah. The garden we're standing in, I did a lot of this garden that way.
Are there any restrictions as far as what sort of newspaper to use in such a process?
Most newspapers are using soy-based inks right now, so the inks are a lot safer. Of course, I don't use any glossy paper, but I don't think there's a problem with small colored photographs, for instance, on newspaper.
What's great about raising worms to get the worm castings is you don't need a lot of space. Tell us about your little setup on your back porch.
Well, I've got a worm bin called a can of worms, and this is a bin that you can buy commercially, and it's quite small. I mean, wouldn't you say it's about the size of an ordinary garbage can? Maybe not even that large.
It's smaller than that.
Yeah, and it has 3 stacking trays, so the worms can move up. It's sort of like a worm condo. They can move up and down through these 3 layers, and it's the easiest thing in the world to walk out the kitchen door, dump food scraps in there, and then pull out castings whenever I need them for the garden.
And again, you would just use those castings in a planting hole. You wouldn't have to buy yards and yards of worm castings to spread throughout a garden area.
That's right. And in fact, it really isn't going to do your garden a lot of good to spread worm castings on the surface. They do have a tendency to sort of dry out and oxidize. They're really best for being underground. So this is great when you're planting new plants, or if you want to sort of work some in around existing plants. Really, really be sure and get it underground and maybe cover it with a layer of mulch.
What about the liquid products that people are now manufacturing using worm castings? Worm tea, I guess. Is that useful? Is that worth the effort?
It is useful. I have a compost tea brewer here that has a little bubbler, like an aquarium bubbler. So you can mix in worm castings with water and let it kind of brew for 24 hours. And what will happen is all those beneficial microbes, their population will really explode in this damp aerobic environment. And then you can use it as a foliar feeding, spray it right on the leaves of plants. And it's really supposed to help, plants grow faster, resist diseases, be better able to fight off pest infestation. So, yeah, it's a great thing to do for your garden.
In your book, you talk about doing some research as far as the benefits of worm castings, that there is some thought that maybe worm castings can ward off plant disease and pests. What have you found out in that regard?
Yeah, I talked to a researcher at Ohio State University. This is one of those rumors. Believe it or not, there are like worm chat rooms out there on the internet. So this is like one of those crazy urban legends about worm castings, is that they will help get rid of aphids and whitefly, which, we're all looking for. Yeah. And so I asked Dr. Edwards at Ohio State University about that, because he does a lot of research on earthworms in agriculture. And he said, there really may be something to that. They have done some greenhouse experiments where they have seen that plants grown in soil that's rich in worm castings really do seem to be left alone by those sucking insects like aphids or like whitefly. I use them on my roses. I haven't had a big problem with aphids since I started doing it. It's one of those things that it can't hurt to try, but the research isn't quite there yet.
You also talk about in your book that there are some plants that worms will shy away from, maybe even run away from if they could possibly run. And one of those is wasabi?
Oh, that's right. They hate wasabi and they hate mustard. Earthworm scientists know all these tricky ways to get worms out of the soil if they want to do an earthworm census. And one of the ways to do that is to sort of impregnate the soil with mustard or wasabi. But, that'll bring a lot of stuff up to the surface. I don't think anybody wants to live in that environment.
There are a lot of farmers and backyard gardeners who will use mustard as a cover crop, especially for its beautiful show of flowers in late winter and early spring in the Sacramento area. But that won't be doing the earthworm population much good, will it?
Well, I doubt that the roots of a mustard plant are really as concentrated as a mustard product made from the seeds. So I don't think it discourages worms too much to use mustard as a cover crop.
What do you feed the worms, by the way?
Oh, good question. They're not very picky eaters. I'll tell you what they don't like. They don't like anything too spicy, so I don't give them onions, garlic, chili peppers. They don't like meat. Dairy, any kind of fat will get very rancid in the bin, so you want to leave that out. So lots of vegetables, all your vegetable trimmings. They love fruit, and I think probably the reason for that is there's a lot of sugars in fruit, which attracts a lot of bacteria, and that's actually what the earthworms are eating. They're not really eating the banana or the mango that you drop in the bin. They're eating all the little microscopic creatures that are eating the mango or the banana. They'll eat paper, so I always put lots of shredded newspaper or shredded computer paper. Coffee grounds, tea bags, plain pasta or rice. So there's plenty that you can feed them.
And how important is the moisture level in a worm composting bin?
It's very important because that's how earthworms breathe. They need their skin needs to be damp in order for them to breathe. They don't have lungs. They breathe through special cells in their skin. So it needs to be about as damp as a wrung-out sponge. If it's too wet, they'll come to the surface the way you see worms mass on the sidewalk after a rainstorm because they're in search of air. And if it's too dry, they just can't survive. So it is important to really watch dampness. And, of course, that's really affected by heat as well.
Speaking of heat, it does get warm in Sacramento. Here in Humboldt County, you're lucky to get over 75, so you can probably raise just about any worm you want. But in the Central Valley and in areas where it does get quite warm, is there a worm that can tolerate the heat better than others?
Well, actually, the worm that's most popular for composting, the red wiggler, which is Latin name Mycenia fetida, is pretty tolerant of a lot of different conditions. It's a very forgiving worm, which I think is one of the reasons it's become so popular for home worm composting. And just make sure that your bin is completely in the shade, that it gets no sun at all. And if you want to bring it into a basement or a garage, keep a thermometer there and really keep an eye on it, because some people's garages get a lot hotter during the day than they might realize.
Well, Amy Stewart, thanks for spending some time with us. Thanks for the tour of your garden. And again, the name of your book is
The Earth Moved on the Remarkable Achievements of Earthworms.
Published by
Algonquin Books.
And available at a bookstore or online near you. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
The Fair Oaks Horticulture Center is a garden gem. It's run by the Sacramento County Master Gardeners. The center includes a water-efficient landscape demonstration, an orchard, which includes fruit bushes, a table grape vineyard, berries, extensive berries, blueberries, blackberries, so much more, a vegetable and herb garden, and an extensive display of composting systems, including vermicomposting. The Fair Oaks Horticulture Center is in Fair Oaks Park, right next to their community garden, and the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center is only open at certain times, though, so do an internet search for the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center for more details and plan a visit sometime. But from 2017, here is our chat with Master Gardener Susan Muckey about their worms and worm bins. Hi, it's Farmer Fred. We're at the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center. It's Open Garden Day on this Saturday in May, and I'm over in the composting center talking with Susan Muckey, Master Gardener. We're over by the worm bin, and we're going to talk a little bit about vermicomposting. Now, this is a little different. This is looks like to be an old wooden wagon that you've got your worms in.
Yes, one of our Master Gardener's husband built this, and actually she had taken her old sandbox from her children and done that at home, and you can't see a picture here, but you can see a picture here, and so that's where they got the idea, and it works really, really great. We fill it with pine shavings, and it takes all of our kitchen waste, and it works really, really well. The worms just eat everything up.
For those that don't have a screen on their radio, I'll describe this container for you. It looks to be a wooden box that's about 18 inches wide, maybe 2 feet wide by about 3 feet long, and it looks to be about 12 inches or so deep.
Right. And we also, when you're making a worm bin, you don't want to make it too deep, because the worms basically just live on the top of the soil, and so it doesn't need to be like a regular compost bin, which would be 3 by 3 by 3. And this works really, really well. This particular bin has wheels on it so that we can move it if we were to need it to move it, because it gets kind of heavy. An interesting fact about compost worms is 5 pounds of worms will eat about 200 pounds of kitchen waste in a month.
In a month?
In a month, yes.
So remind me not to get 5 pounds of worms. I probably should start with 1 pound of worms.
Exactly. And when we sell our bins, which we do at our harvest day, we have a 10-gallon Rubbermaid container, and we give you just a handful of worms, and that's really enough to start your worm bin, a small worm bin.
Now, we should point out that there was a lid to this, a hinged lid, and why do worms need to be covered?
Well, they're very shy. They don't like the light. And so especially if we were to lift the lid off, then the worms would take a nosedive down to the bottom because they don't like the light at all.
And it also keeps out skunks and raccoons and possums.
That's right, or birds that particularly like worms.
So what all is going into this vermicomposting bin? You said you started off with shavings.
Right. We start off with pine shavings. You could start off with shredded newspaper. You just don't want to use redwood shavings. You don't want to use cedar shavings, because those are sort of they're against the insects, and so they would probably repel the worms. They don't like that. But if you go to a like Sheldon Feed or any of the feed stores, you can get a huge bale of shavings and make sure it's either pine or fir, and you just dump it into your bin. You moisten it because the worms have sort of a slimy coating on them, and they need to be able to slither through the bedding. And so you moisten it, and then you just start adding your vegetable scraps from your kitchen, things that you're not eating.
So if you didn't want to use pine shavings, you could, as you mentioned, use shredded newspapers or shredded plain white paper? You
could use shredded newspaper. We're really not heading towards the regular paper. We're just finding out now that laser print has kind of an oil base. That's an oil base, and so we're saying probably don't use that in your worm bin or in your compost pile. We're saying just maybe newspaper and laser print paper, or not laser, but inkjet paper or printed paper is probably okay because the ink is soy-based, and that's okay. You just don't want to use shiny advertisements in your worm bin or in your compost bin, your regular compost bin.
All right, so we've got the bedding for the worms, and we're feeding them kitchen scraps. What are the foods out of our kitchen we should not be putting into this bin with the worms?
They do not like citrus because of the oil on the rinds affects them. They don't like that. We don't put any garlic. We don't put pineapple. Pineapple's too acidic. And we also don't put onion in there.
I have noticed that with my own vermicomposting bin that you can pretty well tell what they will eat and what they won't eat, because when you come back a week or two later and you still see that orange sitting there or even a whole banana peel, you realize, well, maybe I should have cut that up into smaller pieces.
Right. And another thing that's interesting is the worms will eat all the foods around the stickers. And I found a lot of vegetable stickers because I forgot to take them off. They particularly like to, we call it cuddling in the avocado skins, and so you'll pick up an avocado skin that you threw in there and you'll find a whole crowd of them just having a party.
No, but they will eat avocados, but they won't eat other citrus.
That's right.
Wow.
That's right. Well, we don't put the flesh in there.
Oh, okay.
We only put the skin in because we ate the flesh.
Yeah, okay. All right. That makes sense. Now, one thing we didn't point out about this bin, and it's true for any vermicomposting bin where you have worms, it needs drainage because they produce a lot of liquid. And where does that liquid go? What do you do with the liquid?
Well, in this particular bin, because it's made out of wood slats, it's got natural drainage built in, and also it has wheels on it, and it's got another section that kind of keeps it off the ground. When we sell our worm bins, we put holes in the bottom, and we tell people to put their worm bins up on bricks or on 2x4s or something, because you don't want to drown your worms.
How big are the holes are you drilling in this?
Quarter inch.
Right. And you still have all the liquid. Where does the liquid go? Is it just going to the ground below, or can you save that liquid and do something with it?
Well, the bin that I have, I call it an apartment complex, and so it has several layers, and there's one layer at the bottom that doesn't have any holes in it at all, and so all the liquid drains down, and it's actually got a spigot on it, and so I can take that and dilute it and use it in my I wouldn't use it in my vegetable garden, but I would probably use it in my landscaping, and I would dilute it and then you just use it.
Why wouldn't you use it in vegetables?
I would be concerned, like on lettuce or something like that, if there's anything that might be harmful. We're not really sure, and so there hasn't been enough research done on it yet for us to say yes, use it in your vegetables.
Now, the reason for having worms eating your kitchen garbage is what they produce. What do they produce? Where is it? What do you do with it?
They produce the most wonderful looking, it looks kind of like soil, and I never really was into composting until I saw what happens through the months. When you take a banana peel and then it turns into this gorgeous, rich compost, you go, I'm a believer. And so it's extremely high in a lot of microorganisms. It also has a lot of nutritional nutritional value, and it's probably almost like bat guano. It's a very high form of a soil amendment.
And it's called worm castings, and people use it perhaps as a thin layer, as a topping, maybe but put mulch on it. You don't really want to leave it on the soil surface, do you?
No, because it really dries out. And I use it actually a lot in my tomatoes. I just take a scoop of worm compost, mix it into the ground, and then put my tomato plants in. And I really have no problems with my tomatoes through the years. I mean, I just don't have any problems, and I think it's the worm compost.
One of the best foods for your plants that you can grow at home via the worms, a vermicomposting bin. You can see several examples of them here at the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center. Susan Muckey, thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
Finally, to sing the praises of worm excrement, worm castings, is Kellogg Garden Products organic educator Giselle Schoninger. I know that G&B Organics, part of the Kellogg line, has a product called Worm Grow, which is earthworm castings. What is the deal with earthworm castings? Why are they so good for the soil?
Oh, God, that you just touched on one of my favorite products. So it's basically earthworm poop is what a casting is, or vermicompost is another name for it. And our product is made with worm castings, a small amount of forest humus, and seaweed or kelp. And the thing about worm castings is, they will eat any of the organic matter or mineral base left in the soil. So any of the leaves that drop to the ground, the vegetable matter that's in the soil, they will take that into their mouth, and they also take biology into their mouth at the same time. And on the back end, you're basically getting a super fortified, highly nutritious manure that is also infused with beneficial living organisms. So the worm castings are typically 3 to 5 times higher than nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium on the back end. So an earthworm casting, their manure is highly nutritious. It's infused with beneficial living organisms. It's soluble, so a plant can use the nutrients right away. And it's just highly nutritious. It also binds soil together so that it will also retain more moisture. And it also minimizes insect and disease pressures in the garden. Why? Because the plant is so nutrient fortified. I love our worm castings, and I recommend that people add worm castings every time they plant something into the ground.
Now, from what I understand, with worm castings, a little bit goes a long way. With the G&B Worm Grow product, what are the application instructions?
Really, I would say, like, if you're putting let's say you're putting a 4-inch plant into the ground, I'd put about 3 or 4 tablespoons right into that planting hole with your planting mix and with your fertilizer. Mix it right in, and it'll just disappear into the soil. If you have a bug issue, you can mulch with worm castings all the way to the drip line, to where the leaves are and where the dew drops at the end of the drip line around a plant. So you put the worm castings down about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch, and then you want to top it with another mulch. Worm castings can be like a duck's back. The water will bead off of it. So if you cover it with a thin layer of mulch over the top of the worm castings, water it in, within a couple of months, you'll start to see the insects like whitefly leave your plant, because there is an enzyme in the worm castings. It's called chitinase. And chitinase will break down chitin. And chitin is the exoskeleton of an insect. Sorry, that's a very difficult thing to explain. But an insect's exoskeleton is made of chitin. And if you have an enzyme that's going to break it down, that's in the worm castings, it is in Mother Nature's way of controlling certain pests in the garden.
Giselle Schoninger, she's the organic gardening educator for Kellogg Garden Products. Find out more, you can visit their website, kellogggarden.com. Kellogg has 2 G's. for more information about their product lines of soils, soil amendments, fertilizers, and much more. Giselle Schoninger, thanks for a few minutes of your time.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted.
Garden Basics comes out every Tuesday and Friday, and it's available just about anywhere podcasts are handed out, and that includes Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Overcast, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and hey Alexa, play the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast, would you please? Thank you for listening, subscribing, and leaving comments. We appreciate it.